On a bright summer morning in downtown Chicago, Mrs. Richardson walked into Elegant Fashions, one of the city's most prestigious boutiques. She was searching for the perfect dress for an upcoming charity gala where her husband, a prominent figure in the city's business community, would be receiving an award for his philanthropic work. The boutique's crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as she browsed through the racks of designer dresses. Her fingers gently traced the delicate fabrics, silk, chiffon, and fine lace. Despite being one of the city's most influential women, she carried herself with humble grace, dressed simply in a casual blouse and slacks. As she selected a stunning midnight blue evening gown to try on, she noticed the sales associate's dismissive glances. The young man, who had been eagerly assisting other customers, seemed to deliberately avoid making eye contact with her. Mrs. Richardson was used to such treatment. It was an unfortunately common occurrence, even in 2024. "Excuse me," she called out politely, holding up the dress. "Could I try this on?" The sales associate, whose golden nameplate read Robert, barely glanced in her direction before responding curtly, "That particular piece is rather expensive. Perhaps I could show you something from our clearance section?" Mrs. Richardson took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "I'd like to try this one, please." Robert's lips tightened into a thin line as he reluctantly approached. "Very well," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But please be careful with it. This dress costs more than—" He paused, giving her another dismissive look. "Well, let's just say it's quite valuable." As Mrs. Richardson reached for the dress, Robert suddenly yanked it away, causing a sharp ripping sound to echo through the boutique. A 3-inch tear appeared along the dress's delicate seam. The other customers turned to stare as Robert's face reddened with anger. "Look what you've done," he exclaimed, holding up the damaged dress. "This is exactly why I suggested the clearance section. You'll have to pay for this, it's worth $3,000. Mrs. Richardson remained remarkably calm, even as other customers began whispering and pointing. She reached into her purse, but instead of pulling out her wallet, she retrieved her phone. "You're right," she said quietly, her finger hovering over the screen. "Someone will definitely be paying for this dress. But first, I think I should call my husband. He's actually good friends with Mr. Harrison, your CEO. They play golf together at the country club." The color drained from Robert's face as Mrs. Richardson continued, "And I'm sure Mr. Harrison would be very interested to see the security footage of what just happened. You see, my husband and I have been loyal customers here for years, though I suppose you wouldn't know that, since you were so quick to judge me by my appearance." The boutique manager, who had been watching the scene unfold from her office through the security cameras, came rushing out. Her face showed genuine concern and embarrassment as she approached Mrs. Richardson. "Mrs. Richardson, I am so terribly sorry about this incident," the manager said, shooting a stern look at Robert, who now stood frozen in shock. "Please, let me handle this situation immediately." The story of what happened next would soon spread throughout Chicago's social circles, not because of the incident itself, but because of how Mrs. Richardson handled it. Instead of demanding Robert's termination, she did something unexpected that would change multiple lives forever. The boutique fell silent as Mrs. Richardson turned to Robert, who was now visibly trembling. Instead of anger, her eyes showed compassion, something that took everyone by surprise, including the manager who stood ready to dismiss the young salesman on the spot. "I'd like to speak with him privately," Mrs. Richardson said to the manager. "Is there somewhere we could talk?" The manager nodded, gesturing toward her office. As Mrs. Richardson and Robert walked toward the back of the store, whispers rippled through the gathering crowd of customers. The security camera footage would later reveal what transpired in that office, a conversation that would change both their lives forever. "Please, sit down," Mrs. Richardson said softly, motioning to a chair. Robert sank into it, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I want you to tell me why you're working here." Robert looked up, confused by the unexpected question. He had prepared himself for yelling, for threats, for demands for his termination, but not this. I'm putting myself through college, he stammered. Working here helps pay for my business classes. I want to open my own store someday. His voice cracked slightly as he added, but I guess that's over now. Mrs. Richardson listened intently, noting the dream hidden behind his fear. Do you know what my husband does? She asked. Robert shook his head. He's the CEO of Richardson Financial Group. But 30 years ago, he was a janitor at a bank, studying business at night school. Someone gave him a chance when others wouldn't. He never forgot that. Robert's eyes widened as realization dawned on him. The Richardson Financial Group was one of the largest financial institutions in the city. Its founder was known for his philanthropic work, particularly in education and small business development. What happened out there, Mrs. Richardson continued, wasn't just about a dress. It was about assumptions, about treating people with dignity regardless of how they look or what we think they can afford. The dress can be repaired, but the real damage happens when we let prejudice guide our actions. Tears welled up in Robert's eyes. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I don't know why I wasn't raised this way. My mom would be so ashamed. Mrs. Richardson pulled a business card from her purse. I'm not going to ask for your termination, she said, sliding the card across the desk. Instead, I have a proposal for you. The card bore the logo of the Richardson Financial Group and the words, Small Business Development Program. Our company runs a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs, she explained. It includes business training, internship opportunities, and potential startup funding. But it requires commitment, hard work, and most importantly, a genuine understanding of how to treat all people with respect. Robert stared at the card in disbelief. Why would you help me after what I did? Because, Mrs. Richardson smiled, sometimes the people who make the biggest mistakes have the potential to create the most significant change. My husband's mentor taught him that, and he taught it to me. As they stepped out of the office, the manager approached nervously, uncertain of what had transpired. Mrs. Richardson addressed her with quiet authority. Robert will be writing a formal apology, and I trust he'll be completing your company's diversity training program, she said. As for the dress, I'd still like to purchase it, after it's repaired, of course. I think it'll be a perfect reminder of this day. The manager nodded vigorously, relief washing over her face. But Mrs. Richardson wasn't finished. She turned to Robert one last time. The mentorship program starts next month. If you're serious about changing and building your future, be at our office at 9 a.m. on the first Monday. Show me that my faith in you isn't misplaced. As Mrs. Richardson left the boutique, she pulled out her phone to call her husband. She couldn't wait to tell him about the young man who reminded her so much of his younger self, someone who needed just one person to believe in them, to show them a better way. That evening, as Mrs. Richardson shared the day's events with her husband over dinner in their warmly lit dining room, she couldn't have known that across town, Robert was having a life-changing conversation of his own. In a modest two-bedroom apartment, Robert sat at his mother's kitchen table, the business card from Mrs. Richardson trembling in his hands. The aroma of his mother's cooking filled the air, but he couldn't eat. Instead, he found himself confessing everything that had happened at the boutique. His mother, a high school teacher of 30 years, set down her fork and listened intently. When Robert finished his story, tears streaming down his face, she reached across the table and took his hand. You know, she said softly, I've spent my entire career teaching young people that education isn't just about books and grades. It's about becoming someone who makes the world better. She squeezed his hand tightly. Today, you failed that lesson. But Mrs. Richardson just taught you something I've been trying to show you your whole life. Real strength isn't about power over others, it's about lifting them up when you could have pushed them down. Robert glanced at his phone, where he'd already drafted and deleted dozens of applications for new jobs. The business card seemed to burn in his pocket, a chance he knew he didn't deserve but desperately wanted to take. Meanwhile, at the Richardson household, Mr. Richardson was reviewing the security footage from the boutique that the manager had sent over. He watched his wife's handling of the situation with pride, but also with deep understanding. They had both faced their share of prejudice and discrimination throughout their journey to success. "You know," he said, turning to his wife, "that young man reminds me of someone I used to know." He smiled, thinking back to his own past. A young man who thought he knew everything about success, until someone showed him what real leadership looks like. Mrs. Richardson nodded, remembering the stories he'd told her about his own mentor, the late Mr. Chen, who had seen potential in a young janitor who spent his lunch breaks reading business books in the bank's break room. The next morning, Robert arrived at the boutique an hour early for his shift. He had spent most of the night thinking about his future, about the kind of person he wanted to be. The manager was surprised to find him waiting at the door, holding a carefully written letter of apology and a request for enrollment in every available training program the company offered. But Robert's transformation wasn't going to be easy. As he worked through his shift that day, he overheard the whispers from his coworkers. The story had spread, and some were resentful that he hadn't been fired. Others watched his every move, waiting for him to make another mistake. During his lunch break, he found himself staring at Mrs. Richardson's business card again. The small business development program started in just 3 weeks. The thought of walking into the Richardson Financial Group building, facing Mrs. Richardson again, made his stomach churn with anxiety. But then he remembered the look in her eyes, not of anger or contempt, but of belief in the person he could become. He pulled out his phone and, with shaking fingers, typed an email. "Dear Mrs. Richardson, I cannot fully express my gratitude for the opportunity you've offered me, nor my deep regret for my actions yesterday. I want you to know that I've enrolled in every diversity and customer service training program available at the boutique. I'm also taking an online course in cultural sensitivity that my mother, a teacher, recommended. If the offer still stands, I would be honored to participate in the small business development program. Not just to further my own dreams, but to ensure that when I do open my own business someday, it will be one where every customer feels valued and respected. I know I have a long way to go to prove myself worthy of your faith in me, but I am committed to doing whatever it takes. Sincerely, Robert." As he hit send, Robert didn't know that his email would arrive just as Mrs. Richardson was meeting with her husband and their diversity and inclusion team, planning something much bigger than just one mentorship spot. The incident at the boutique had sparked an idea, one that would soon transform not just Robert's life, but the lives of countless other young entrepreneurs in their city. 2 weeks after the incident, Mrs. Richardson stood before the board of directors at Richardson Financial Group, presenting a vision that had been forming in her mind since that day at the boutique. The repaired midnight blue dress hung in her office as a reminder of how a single moment could spark meaningful change. "What happened at Elegant Fashions isn't unique," she addressed the room of executives. "But our response to it can be. We have an opportunity to transform this incident into something that could change our entire community." She clicked to the next slide of her presentation, revealing statistics about discrimination in retail and small businesses. "Our current mentorship program is excellent, but it's not enough. I propose we launch the Richardson Equity Initiative, a comprehensive program that combines business education with practical training in diversity, equity, and inclusion." In the audience, her husband watched with pride. He had always known his wife was remarkable, but her ability to turn a potentially negative situation into an opportunity for widespread change still amazed him. Meanwhile, across town, Robert was experiencing his own transformation. The past 2 weeks had been challenging. Some customers who had witnessed the incident still gave him cold looks, and a few of his coworkers remained distant. But he had thrown himself into his training with determination. During a particularly busy afternoon at the boutique, an elderly woman with a cane entered the store. Robert noticed other sales associates busying themselves with inventory, seemingly avoiding her. Without hesitation, he approached her with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Elegant Fashions," he said warmly. "May I help you find something?" The woman explained she needed a dress for her granddaughter's wedding but was having trouble walking through the store. Robert spent the next hour patiently bringing options to her, ensuring she was comfortable, and treating her with the respect and attention she deserved. When she finally found the perfect dress, tears welled in her eyes. "Young man," she said, patting his hand, "thank you for making an old woman feel valued. That's rare these days." The boutique manager, who had been watching the interaction, pulled Robert aside afterward. "That was Mrs. Chen," she said quietly. "She's been shopping here for 40 years. Her late husband was actually a mentor to Mr. Richardson before he passed away." Robert felt a chill run down his spine at the connection. He couldn't help but wonder if this was more than just coincidence. That evening, he received an email from Mrs. Richardson. "Dear Robert, your email touched me deeply, and your commitment to growth hasn't gone unnoticed. I've heard about your dedication to training and your improved interactions with customers. But what truly impressed me was how you treated Mrs. Chen today, not because of who she is, but because of who you're becoming. I'm pleased to inform you that the Small Business Development Program has evolved into something bigger. We're launching the Richardson Equity Initiative, and we would like you to be part of our first cohort. This isn't just about business education anymore, it's about creating a new generation of business leaders who understand that success and social responsibility go hand in hand. The program starts next week. You'll be one of 20 participants selected from across the city. Each of you has a unique story, and together, you'll learn not just how to build successful businesses, but how to build a more inclusive community. Your journey over the past 2 weeks has helped shape this initiative. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth, not just for ourselves, but for others as well. The choice is yours, Robert. Are you ready to be part of something bigger than yourself? Best regards, Mrs. Richardson. As Robert read the email, his mother called him to dinner. He walked to the kitchen, where she was grating papers at the table while stirring a pot of soup. She noticed the look on his face immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Robert showed her the email, and as she read it, he saw tears forming in her eyes. "Mom? You know," she said, putting down her red grading pen, "I've always told my students that education can change their lives. But sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the classroom. You're proving that right now." Robert looked at the calendar on the wall, where he had already circled the start date of the program in bold red ink. "I'm scared," he admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I let Mrs. Richardson down again?" His mother smiled, remembering the little boy who had once been too afraid to ride a bike but eventually became the neighborhood's fastest cyclist. "The fact that you're scared means you understand how important this is. But remember, Mrs. Richardson isn't just giving you an opportunity. She's asking you to help create change for others. That's not a burden, son. That's a gift." The morning of the Richardson Equity Initiative's launch arrived with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Robert stood outside the gleaming Richardson Financial Group building, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. He'd arrived an hour early, his mother's words of encouragement still echoing in his mind. Inside the building's conference center, Mrs. Richardson was reviewing her opening speech when her husband walked in, carrying a garment bag. She immediately recognized it, the midnight blue dress from Elegant Fashions, now perfectly repaired. "I thought you might want to wear this today," he said softly. Sometimes the most powerful statements don't need words. As participants began arriving, Robert found himself in a room with 19 other young entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds. There was a food truck owner who had faced banking discrimination, a web designer who had overcome housing insecurity, and several small business owners who had struggled to secure loans despite having solid business plans. Mrs. Richardson walked in wearing the midnight blue dress, and a hush fell over the room. Robert felt his chest tighten with emotion, understanding the significance of her choice. She began her address with characteristic grace. "Welcome to the first day of what I hope will be not just a program, but a movement. Each of you is here because your stories, your struggles, and your dreams matter. Some of you might be wondering why you were chosen. Let me tell you about a dress." As she shared the story of what happened at the boutique, Robert found himself no longer feeling shame but a sense of purpose. She didn't paint him as a villain or herself as a hero. Instead, she spoke about moments of choice, how a single decision could either perpetuate harm or create opportunity for change. During the morning break, Robert was surprised when Mr. Richardson himself approached him. "Walk with me," the CEO said, leading him to his office. On the wall hung a black and white photograph of a young man mopping a bank floor, while an older Asian man in a business suit pointed to a book they were discussing. "That's me and Mr. Chen," Mr. Richardson explained. "The man who taught me that true success isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give back. He used to say that everyone deserves a second chance, but not everyone gets one. Those who do have a responsibility to make it count, not just for themselves, but for others." Robert studied the photograph, seeing the parallel to his own story. "I won't let you down, sir." "It's not about letting us down," Mr. Richardson replied. "It's about lifting others up. That's what this initiative is all about." Back in the conference room, the day's sessions began. Instead of traditional business lectures, the program started with participants sharing their stories. The food truck owner spoke about how banks had dismissed her traditional family recipes as too niche. The web designer described living in his car while building websites for clients who didn't know his situation. When it was Robert's turn, he stood with shaking hands but a steady voice. "I'm here because I made a terrible mistake," he began. "But I'm also here because someone saw past that mistake to who I could become." He looked at Mrs. Richardson as he continued, "And now I want to help create a business world where no one feels judged by their appearance or background, where everyone gets the respect I failed to give that day." During lunch, unexpected visitors arrived, the staff from Elegant Fashions, including the manager. They had come to announce that the boutique was partnering with the initiative to provide professional attire and styling services to program participants for their business presentations and interviews. The manager pulled Robert aside. "Your journey these past weeks has inspired changes in our own training and hiring practices," she explained. "Sometimes it takes seeing our own reflection clearly to realize we all have room to grow." As the day progressed, the participants broke into smaller groups to begin developing their business plans. Robert found himself working with the food truck owner and two others. As they shared ideas, he realized that his dream of opening a boutique could be more than just a business, it could be a platform for change. "What if," he suggested to his group, "we created businesses that not only serve our communities but actively work to break down the barriers we've faced? What if my boutique partnered with your food truck for cultural celebration events, showcasing both fashion and cuisine from different traditions?" The excitement in the room was palpable as similar collaborations began forming across other groups. Mrs. Richardson watched from the back of the room, seeing her vision taking shape in ways she hadn't even imagined. At the end of the day, as participants were leaving, an elderly gentleman walked into the conference center. Robert recognized him immediately from the photograph in Mr. Richardson's office. It was Mr. Chen, but much older than in the picture. "That's Mr. Chen's son," Mrs. Richardson explained, seeing Robert's confusion. "He's a successful business owner himself now, and he'll be one of your mentors in the program." The younger Mr. Chen approached Robert with a warm smile. "My father always said that the true measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, but in what they choose to do after. Welcome to the family." As Robert headed home that evening, his mind was swimming with ideas and possibilities. His phone buzzed with a group text, the other participants were already planning to meet over the weekend to continue their discussions. He smiled, realizing that what had started as the worst day of his life had somehow become the beginning of something extraordinary. 3 months into the Richardson Equity Initiative, the program had already begun transforming lives in ways no one had anticipated. The conference room that had hosted their first meeting was now covered in vision boards, business plans, and a large map of the city marked with upcoming business locations. Robert's weekend shift at Elegant Fashions had become something he looked forward to. The boutique had undergone its own transformation, with new training programs and a community outreach initiative that brought in diverse clientele. Regular customers began noticing the change in atmosphere, and sales had actually increased. One Saturday morning, a familiar face walked through the door, Mrs. Chen, this time accompanied by her granddaughter. Robert welcomed them warmly, remembering their previous interaction. "My grandmother hasn't stopped talking about you," the granddaughter said with a smile. "She insisted on coming back here to find my wedding dress." As Robert helped them browse through wedding gowns, Mrs. Chen shared stories about her late husband's friendship with Mr. Richardson. "You remind me of him," she said quietly to Robert. "He believed that fashion wasn't just about clothes, it was about helping people feel seen and valued." Meanwhile, across town, the food truck owner from Robert's initiative group had parked her truck outside a local community center. She was hosting a pop-up event combining her family's traditional cuisine with a fashion show featuring designs from other program participants. The idea had grown from their first-day brainstorming session. Mrs. Richardson arrived at the event, once again wearing the midnight blue dress that had started it all. She watched with pride as local residents sampled authentic dishes while models of all sizes and backgrounds showcased affordable, elegant clothing designed with cultural appreciation in mind. Back at the boutique, Robert was having a breakthrough moment with the wedding dress selection. The granddaughter had tried on several gowns but hadn't found the one. Drawing on his training and newfound understanding, Robert asked about their family's traditions and cultural preferences. "Actually," the granddaughter admitted, "I've been worried about finding a dress that honors both our traditions and my modern style." Robert remembered a designer from the initiative who specialized in fusion fashion. He pulled out his phone and showed them her portfolio. "We could work with her to customize your dress. It would be a perfect blend of traditional elements and contemporary design." Mrs. Chen's eyes welled up with tears. "This is exactly what my husband meant when he talked about business being about building bridges between people." That evening, during the initiative's weekly dinner meeting, a tradition that had started spontaneously when participants didn't want to stop their discussions at the end of sessions, Robert shared his experience with the group. The designer was thrilled about the collaboration opportunity, and others began suggesting ways to contribute to the wedding preparation. The web designer offered to create a website showcasing the dress's journey from concept to creation, documenting how traditional elements were being incorporated into modern design. Another participant, who owned a small catering company, volunteered to create fusion appetizers for the final fitting celebration. Mrs. Richardson, who often joined these dinners, watched the collaboration unfold with satisfaction. She turned to her husband and whispered, "Remember when we thought this program was just about business education?" Mr. Richardson smiled, thinking about his own mentor. Mr. Chen always said that true change happens when people stop seeing transactions and start seeing connections. The next week, as Robert presented his updated business plan to the initiative's mentorship panel, he didn't just talk about profit margins and market analysis. He shared his vision for a boutique that would serve as a community hub, a place where fashion could bridge cultural gaps and bring people together. 3 months ago, I thought success meant selling expensive dresses to wealthy customers, he admitted. Now I understand that real success is creating a space where everyone feels valued, where fashion becomes a way to celebrate our differences and our common humanity. Mr. Chen's son, who sat on the panel, leaned forward. "You know, my father would have loved this. He always believed that the best businesses don't just serve the community, they help build it." After the presentation, Mrs. Richardson pulled Robert aside. "We've been approached by several major retailers," she told him. "They've heard about our initiative and want to implement similar training programs. Would you be willing to share your story as part of their training materials?" Robert felt a moment of hesitation, remembering the shame of that first day. But then he thought about how that moment had led to all of this, the connections made, the lives touched, the bridges built. "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best contributions," he said, echoing what she had told him months ago. "If sharing my story can help create more change, I'm ready." As he drove home that evening, Robert passed by the community center where the food truck event had been held. The owner was just closing up, and he stopped to help her clean. They talked about their upcoming projects and the ways their businesses could support each other. "You know what's funny?" she said as they worked. "We all came into this program thinking we were going to learn how to make money. Instead, we're learning how to make a difference." Robert smiled, thinking about Mrs. Chen's wedding dress project and all the collaborations that had sprung from it. "Maybe that's the real business lesson in all of this," he replied. "Success isn't just about what we achieve for ourselves, it's about what we help others achieve along the way." 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Elegant Fashions was transformed for a special evening event. The boutique's crystal chandeliers sparkled above an unusual mix of guests, retail executives from across the country, local business owners, initiative participants, and community members. The occasion was the final fitting of Mrs. Chen's granddaughter's wedding dress, but it had evolved into something much more significant. The dress, a stunning fusion of traditional elements and modern design, had become a symbol of the changes sweeping through the city's business community. Robert stood near the entrance, greeting guests alongside Mrs. Richardson. He wore a suit that had been custom-made by another initiative participant who had opened a tailoring business. The nervous young man who had once judged customers by their appearance was gone, replaced by someone who saw the value in every person who walked through the door. "Can you believe this all started with a ripped dress?" Mrs. Richardson whispered to him as they watched the crowd mingle. Local news crews were setting up their cameras, preparing to document what had become a landmark moment in the city's business community. The boutique's display windows now showcased designs from diverse creators, and the store had become known for its inclusive atmosphere. Regular customers chatted with initiative participants, sharing stories over appetizers created by the food truck owner, who had recently opened her first restaurant. Mr. Richardson arrived with a special guest, the CEO of the country's largest retail chain. They had just signed an agreement to implement the Richardson Equity Initiative's training program across their stores nationwide. The CEO had insisted on attending tonight's event after hearing Robert's story. "Your honesty about your journey has helped us recognize our own blind spots," the CEO told Robert. "Sometimes it takes one person's courage to help others find theirs." The evening's centerpiece was the reveal of the wedding dress. The designer, who had collaborated with Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, had woven elements of their family history into the modern silhouette. Gold threads in the embroidery matched the pattern of Mrs. Chen's own wedding dress from 50 years ago. As the bride-to-be emerged from the fitting room, gasps of appreciation filled the air. The dress was more than beautiful, it was a testament to what could happen when tradition and innovation came together. Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering, "My husband would have loved this." The web designer's documentary about the dress's creation played on screens throughout the store, showing how the collaboration had brought together different aspects of the initiative. Local artists, craftspeople, and business owners had all contributed their talents to the project. During the celebration, Mrs. Richardson called everyone's attention for an announcement. 6 months ago, a torn dress taught us that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Richardson Equity Initiative will be expanding to 5 more cities next year. She paused, looking around the room. But more importantly, we're establishing a permanent retail incubator space in our downtown area. This space will provide opportunities for small business owners from underserved communities to showcase their products and build their customer base. Robert felt a tap on his shoulder. It was the boutique manager, holding an envelope. "This seems like the right moment," she said, handing it to him. Inside was a letter offering him a position as the incubator space's first director of operations. His hands trembled as he read it, remembering the day he'd thought his career was over. The food truck owner, now a successful restaurant owner, raised her glass in a toast. "To second chances," she said, "and to the people who believe in them." As the evening continued, Robert found a quiet moment with Mrs. Richardson near the display where it had all begun. The midnight blue dress that had started their journey was now part of a historical display about the initiative's origins. "I've been thinking," he said, "about adding an educational component to the incubator space. A place where retailers can learn about inclusive business practices, not just through training sessions, but through real interactions with the community." Mrs. Richardson smiled. "You know, when I walked into this store that day, I was just looking for a dress. Instead, I found a partner in creating change." Later that night, as the guests began to leave, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter approached Robert with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the dress, but for showing us that change is possible when we open our hearts to it." The local news crews captured the final moments of the evening, Mrs. Richardson and Robert standing together near the window display, the torn dress that had brought them together now a symbol of how far they'd come. "Sometimes," Mrs. Richardson told the reporter, "the most beautiful things can come from moments that seem irreparable. All it takes is the courage to see beyond the tear to the possibility of something new." As Robert locked up the boutique that night, he paused to look at his reflection in the window. The lights of the city sparkled behind him, and he could see the outline of the Richardson Financial Group building in the distance. In 6 months, one moment of prejudice had transformed into a movement of change, touching lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined. He thought about the incubator space and all the future entrepreneurs who would find their start there. Each one would have their own story, their own journey of growth and transformation. And he would be there to help guide them, remembering always that success isn't just measured in profits, but in the lives we touch along the way. 1 year to the day after the dress incident, the downtown area had transformed into a vibrant marketplace of diverse businesses. The retail incubator space, now known as the Richardson Community Marketplace, occupied a renovated historic building just 2 blocks from Elegant Fashions. Its grand opening ceremony was about to begin, and the streets were filled with excited visitors. Robert stood at the entrance, his mother by his side. She squeezed his hand, both of them taking in the magnitude of the moment. Inside, 20 new businesses were preparing to welcome their first customers. Each owner had a unique story, and many had faced barriers similar to those the original initiative participants had overcome. "I need to show you something before everyone arrives," Mrs. Richardson called out, guiding Robert through the marketplace. They stopped at a wall near the entrance, where a large photograph hung beside the now famous midnight blue dress. The photo showed Robert helping Mrs. Chen's granddaughter with her wedding dress, both of them smiling warmly. "This wall will showcase a new story each month," Mrs. Richardson explained. "Stories of transformation, second chances, and community. We're calling it the Moments of Change Gallery." The food truck owner, now operating 3 successful restaurants, had set up a special breakfast station for the opening. Her fusion cuisine had become a symbol of how different cultures could blend beautifully. Next to her, the web designer's digital marketing agency was helping new business owners set up their online presence. As the crowd gathered for the opening ceremony, familiar faces appeared. Mrs. Chen arrived with her granddaughter and new grandson-in-law, their wedding photos displayed prominently in the gallery. The boutique manager came with her entire staff, all wearing pins that read "Fashion has no boundaries," the new slogan they'd adopted after the incident. Mr. Richardson took the podium, but instead of delivering a prepared speech, he shared a story. Many of you know about the dress that sparked this movement, he began, but today I want to tell you about another piece of clothing, the janitor's uniform I wore 30 years ago, when Mr. Chen first saw potential in me. He gestured to Robert. Today, we're not just opening a marketplace. We're opening doors of opportunity. Every person who walks through these doors has a story, and every story deserves to be heard. The ceremony continued with a ribbon cutting, but with a twist. Instead of a single ribbon, there were 20, one for each new business owner. They all cut their ribbons simultaneously, symbolizing the community rising together. Robert's first task as director was to welcome a group of retail executives who had come to learn about implementing inclusive business practices. As he led them through the marketplace, he stopped at each shop, letting the owners share their experiences. You see, he explained to the executives, true change doesn't come from training manuals alone. It comes from understanding each person's journey, from recognizing that every customer who walks into your store brings their own story. In the afternoon, Robert's mother arrived with her high school business class. The marketplace had become a living classroom, where students could learn about entrepreneurship while seeing diversity and inclusion in action. She beamed with pride as she watched her son teaching the next generation about respect, opportunity, and the true meaning of success. The day's biggest surprise came when a group of young entrepreneurs from another city arrived. They had heard about the initiative and wanted to learn how to create something similar in their community. Among them was a young sales associate who had recently had her own moment of realization about prejudice in retail. I read your story, she told Robert, and it gave me courage to speak up about the discrimination I witnessed in my own workplace. Now our manager wants to know more about your training program. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the marketplace's historic windows, Mrs. Richardson gathered everyone for a final moment. The midnight blue dress had been moved to a central display, surrounded by photographs of all the lives it had touched over the past year. 1 year ago, she said, a torn dress showed us that sometimes our biggest mistakes can become our greatest teachers. Today, we're not just celebrating new businesses. We're celebrating new beginnings, second chances, and the power of believing in people's potential to change. Robert looked around at the gathered crowd, business owners, customers, mentors, and students, all brought together by a moment that could have ended very differently. He thought about the young man he'd been a year ago, so quick to judge, so blind to the richness of human experience. Mrs. Chen approached him with a small package. Inside was her husband's old business card holder, made of worn leather and filled with wisdom from decades of mentorship. He would have wanted you to have this, she said. To remind you that every business card you receive is more than just a name, it's a story waiting to be heard. As the evening wound down, Robert walked through the marketplace one last time. Each shop had its lights on, casting a warm glow into the street. Through the windows, he could see people of all backgrounds shopping, talking, and connecting. The next morning, before the marketplace opened, Robert arrived early to find a line of people waiting, not just to shop, but to inquire about starting their own businesses. As he unlocked the doors, he remembered Mrs. Richardson's words from a year ago, sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best contributions. A young woman at the front of the line stepped forward, clutching a business plan. I heard this is where dreams get a second chance, she said hopefully. Robert smiled, thinking of his own journey. No, he replied, opening the door wide. This is where they get their first real chance. And so, what began with a torn dress had become a tapestry of transformation, woven from threads of understanding, second chances, and the belief that every person's story deserves to be part of a larger picture. One that continues to grow, one dream at a time.